Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to VUX World. I'm your host, as always, Kane Sims, and I have an epic conversation lined up for you today with Richard Moore, who's a senior research fellow at Sheffield Hallam University. We're going to be talking about a supreme use case that Richard's been working on, which is to help children move more using conversational AI. And Richard will tell us the background and the details, but essentially there is a bit of an epidemic going on at the moment where kids are just not doing exercise. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, from probably the age of about, I don't know, 4 till 17, 18, you just couldn't get me off a football pitch. And I spent most of my childhood moving. My wife was exactly the same. Most of her childhood was spent swimming. Seemingly these days, kids don't tend to move quite as much as they once did. And so Richard's conversational AI chatbot is intending to kind of sort that out, essentially. We know that moving more, being healthy, doing exercise is better for everyone. It's better for your brain, better for your body. And so how can conversational AI help that? We're about to find out in just one moment. But before that, I want to give a shout out to our presenting sponsor for this episode of VWorks World, which is Tidio. Now, you might not have heard of Tidio. It's been around for quite a while, and it specializes in helping small to medium-sized online businesses improve their customer experience. It's heavily focused or has a huge presence in retail, and essentially it helps you maximize your capacity without having to take on additional hiring costs. It's a platform, it's a live chat platform with conversational AI. It's got domain-specific language model for retail already built in, which means you can ask it questions about things like product recommendations, discounts based on customer behavior. It'll do things like it can personalize the shopping experience, and it's answering 4 out of 5 questions successfully, which is pretty good. 80% of conversations with Tidio's AI seemingly is successful. Product availability, shipping, order status, returns, all of those kind of use cases that you would expect. And if you want to achieve more with fewer resources, then you can try Tidio today. You can use Tidio.com is the website /VUX, and there's an offer there if you want to test it out for 20% off. So please do visit Tidio.com /VUX if you want to supercharge your online retail journeys. Okay. Thank you very much for Tidio for presenting VUX World. Delighted to have you on board. Without further ado then, boys and girls, let's get into the meat of today's action. Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Richard Moore of Sheffield Hallam University to VUX World. Richard, welcome.
Hi, Kane. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Very good. We could have done this in person. You're just up the road.
No, I was just about to say that. Exactly. Yeah. Lovely day. We could have done it outside as well.
We could have done that, yeah. What the audio quality would have been like, but we certainly won't be getting rained on, which is unusual for where we are. Well, I'm getting a studio. I don't know if anyone knows. I'm getting a studio built right now in our garage. Is getting converted into a proper podcast studio, and so part 2 of this, when the chatbot reaches the next level, we will definitely do from VUX World Towers. It's a single-story tower, of course, so it's not a very big tower, but it will be a very nice studio environment where we can do more in-person podcasting. So there you go. I'll be delighted to welcome you there when it's ready. Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you for joining us. Thank you for jumping on the podcast. So we were at Rework. We were both at the Rework conference. I didn't get a chance to actually speak to you at Rework because after your talk, you were kind of just swamped by every time I looked at you, someone was talking to you, and I didn't want to interrupt. So I thought, well, let's try and do the podcast. And it was a very interesting talk that you gave. I'll give a little bit of an insight into the background of this use case, and I'd love to learn a little bit about where it came from, first of all. But second of all, but first of all, tell us a little bit about kind of yourself and how you sort of got involved in wanting to explore conversational AI in the first place.
Yes, so I've been a researcher now for over 10 years at Sheffield Hallam. A lot of my work has involved evaluation of national programmes, most of those involving young people. So projects aimed at trying to get young people more active. I suppose when we first started, it was mainly around participation. So how can we drive participation and get more young people involved? And it's kind of shifted over the past probably 6 or 7 years towards well-being and looking at physical and mental well-being and how we can prove that through physical activity. And about 5 years ago, I was just really interested in kind of moving from evaluation because we'd learned so much, got a huge kind of knowledge base from all the projects that we've worked on. How could we apply that knowledge into developing an intervention which actually supports young people to get more physically active? And behaviour was one of the key reasons behind it, because we don't really understand young people that well, and we don't understand the barriers. And then there was a kind of a light bulb moment when I came across few chatbots, one in particular, Wobot. And you could see how that communicated with its audience in a kind of reassuring, empathetic manner, and could potentially deliver support through that chatbot for mental well-being. So potentially we thought we could apply this to a chatbot which looks at physical activity, particularly around the barriers that young people face.
Nice. And what are those barriers? What are the kind of, what was the kind of reason for wanting to do this over and above kind of like, it would be nice if young people move more? Like why are they not moving more? Is there any data that would suggest that the children are not doing as much exercise today? Like, why was that a focus?
Yeah, well, we were really lucky. I mean, there has been quite a lot of studies around barriers and facilitators for young people engaging in physical activity. But a lot of the interventions haven't been successful. So if you look at kind of the Lancet, which is the leading health journal, the World Health Organization, both released reports stating that there's more needs to be done, more interventions, particularly using digital technologies to provide that support. So we're really lucky because we were able to do a national study. So a couple of my colleagues led on a study with Sport England, which allowed us to survey over 200,000 young people. So as part of that, one of the questions was, what stops you from taking part in physical activity? So from there, we did some more research to identify what those barriers are. And then that's kind of led on the journey with Phyllis to look at what types of interventions we can use to overcome each of those barriers. So we've done some work around it. We've identified 56 barriers. And then we've used existing theoretical frameworks and models, so such as the COM-B and the Trans Theoretical Domains framework, to help us to categorize what those barriers are, understand what the sources of behavior are, and also to then identify potential intervention functions which can be used to overcome those behavior. And that's what we're doing now in terms of programming the chatbot, the interventions that are used to deliver that support.
Nice. So I mentioned to you kind of before we kind of went live that, you know, a lot of chatbots and conversational AI in general, in terms of they've got a lot of good technology that's there to understand people, a lot of, you know, sophisticated natural language understanding capabilities and things like that. But a lot of them are fairly kind of dumb in a sense of what they're doing is they're taking an input, classifying it, and then just serving a response. And there's not really much of a sort of brain behind a lot of them. You know, it's kind of like, okay, you said that, now I'll give you a response that's this. And if you wanted to try and do something that is kind of, you know, based on something that's got more sort of depth to it, you kind of need to rely on, you know, either the science behind the conversation or being able to pick up on a situation that a user is in, sort of thing, to be able to guide them properly. But that's not necessarily just based on the intent that they have, so to speak. There's a whole lot of other things to kind of go to. It is interesting to kind of hear you talk through, and we'll get to that kind of shortly, which is these frameworks that underpin the chatbot, which is, you know, it's not just something that is recognizing the intent from someone and serving them a response. It's actually a full-on sort of like behavior change framework that sits behind it that underpins the conversation, which is great. So we'll definitely get onto that in just a moment. But I just want to kind of go back a sec to the study that you did, found that there was barriers to people kind of to children exercising or moving more frequently. Why was it that kind of like, what is it about the nature of the interface of a conversational assistant that kind of led you down that path? You mentioned Warbot, and that's fair enough, but you know, the NHS has got a lot of content on their website, and there's lots of other kind of services out there, you know, lots of I don't know, football clubs and swimming clubs, and you know, there's lots of other things out there, lots of other areas of intervention. What was it specifically about conversational interface that you thought would add value to this kind of aims that you had?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, when I talked about participation, so there's a lot of focus on just providing more different types of activities. So there was a kind of big move towards alternative activities, you know, for instance, like skateboarding and different kind of adventure activities like that to try and engage people. But what we've since found is that there's a lot of psychological reasons which stop young people from taking that first step towards physical activity. So there could be lots of different reasons, lots of different activities out there that they might enjoy, they'd like to do, but there's a lot of psychological reasons which are preventing that. And that's a real shame. And there's also lots of issues that are created around social media, for instance, so body image, appearance, which kind of prevent people from wanting to maybe look sweaty in a physical activity environment, wear the right clothes, lots of peer pressure. But also there's other kind of social factors around it as well. So, there's a lot of kind of need for private enterprise running sports these days, rather than kind of sports running in schools and by the community, less youth clubs, for instance. So you need money to be able to participate in sport. And if you haven't got money, then that's kind of another barrier to participation. But one of the key barriers is confidence. People having the confidence to actually go and do physical activity, particularly in groups. They're worried about fear of failure, not being successful within that kind of environment. And then it can breed other psychological challenges like anxiety, depression. So if they're already suffering from those kind of conditions, then physical activity can actually make it worse because of the lack of confidence. When you see the research, it should be making us feel better. And it does once we're engaging it properly. But making that initial step is often quite a difficult one to take. And sorry, Conversational Hour is brilliant for it because it allows us to engage with young people in a way we've never really been able to do before. So, for instance, it's quite difficult for young people to maybe go to children, young people to go to a parent or a school teacher, or even go and see a doctor and talk about some of the issues that they face. So if they can use a chatbot, which is going to be available 24/7, so they can maybe access it in the bedroom at night or even after school, it's potentially non-judgmental. It can provide that reassuring content, which might just allow them to take the step to get the support they need to overcome those barriers. And we think that might be a good initial step for them, rather than having to speak to parents or speak to teachers. And maybe a step that might be further down the line will be to actually interact with those people. But I think initially they need that confidence and support that Conversation can provide to take that step.
Brilliant. I remember coming across a chatbot from a few years back, actually, that it was intended to support women that were victims of domestic abuse, and it was specifically in India. And apparently this might be a generalization, but according to the people that were presenting this, the culture over there is that it's very sort of male dominated and can be quite oppressive in cases. And so this chatbot was there to support women who are victims of domestic abuse, and in exactly the same way as you mentioned there, that people feel comfortable talking to it because it's non-judgmental. That was the exact reason why the chatbot was so successful, because they felt very ashamed of speaking to anyone about it anyway. And then also what they realized, you mentioned again, they can use it in the bedroom. What they realized is that the usage of the chatbot, the people who built it, I can't remember who built it now. I should really find out. They noticed that it was used more at between 2 and 4 o'clock in the morning was like the predominant time it was used. And it's obviously because the abuser, so to speak, is asleep, and it's the only time they feel kind of like they are in some kind of a safe space to be able to have the conversation. So there's definitely something to a conversational interface, that kind of, it doesn't make a noise. It's not like talking to Alexa. It's easy and digestible. It's not like trying to read and read pages and pages. And you almost, maybe, I don't know if you found this with the research, this could be complete rubbish, but I get the feeling that providing it does understand you and you've got a genuine back and forth, you feel as though you're talking to someone about it, which helps you get stuff off your chest,
Yeah, definitely. I think particularly with issues around physical activity, I don't think people make the connection that there could be those psychological challenges or other social challenges actually preventing them. I mean, we all have these barriers, really, but until you actually start to look at it and consider it, you don't realize that there could be lots of different things stopping from being physically active. So I think in the case of that use case you mentioned there, other use cases, that there's so many potential ways that we can provide support to people. and just give them that initial reassuring content that might actually drive a conversation with, obviously not in the use case you described, but might actually drive them to have a conversation with the police or someone else. And we're actually bidding for funding at the moment around for an organisation called UK Anti-Doping. So they want to encourage athletes to whistleblow on drug-related offences and cheats in sport. So exactly the same way, really. It's how can we give them the information, the courage, the support to then report these instances and feel that they're going to be listened to, and there's not going to be negative consequences to the athlete as a result of that. And this is a great way of doing it potentially anonymously as well, without anyone else really being in the loop.
Interesting. So you completed there's some data to suggest that children are not exercising or moving. You did your own kind of research that found barriers. You come across the fact that a conversational interface seems to be the most appropriate type of interface to deliver this information through. What was your next step there? Where did you start in being able to construct this chatbot?
Yeah, we also did some work with PE teaching, again, on a separate study for the Department of Health and Social Care. So we'd done some work with them and looked at the barriers as well. So there's probably about 30 barriers, I think, that they thought that less active, particularly those from deprived communities suffering. So we kind of had this initial evidence base to work from. And then the next step was to co-design with young people. So we identified 10 young people and we set a criteria for them to be involved. So they had to feel that they had something that was preventing them from being physically active. We had to try and engage different genders, different ages, all adolescent age and ethnicities as well. And then we had an initial interview with them. We actually took a robot down from the computing lab. So they did a little, Pepper did a little dance for them just to get them engaged, just to do a bit of ice breaking, I suppose, at the start. And then we did an interview with them. So we had 2 or 3 different researchers just having a chat, just finding out what the barriers were, whether they kind of matched the criteria we were looking for, but also matched the barriers that we'd identified previously. And then we just had a conversation and to see what they thought about chatbots, what their initial perceptions were. And it was really interesting. Again, that was another kind of light bulb moment for me, is that they were already expecting it. And this is what is really key for us going forward in this area, is that young people are expecting to be able to use chatbots and they have high expectations of what they can do. And the fact that this wasn't available to them already, they were quite surprised, really. So it shows we're quite behind in terms of what the young people are going to be expecting as they get older. But they were really keen on it. They wanted to support the design of the chatbot, and they felt this could be a really good tool. Again, based on the assumptions that we'd made previously, they kind of agreed with all of those. So that kind of set the chain in motion to do the co-design. And the second stage of that was to produce a document, which was kind of a co-design pamphlet or a kind of, it was a PowerPoint presentation basically, and it allowed them to provide lots of information about the chatbot, again, in their own time, anonymously as well. And when we captured information about the types of content that could be delivered through the chatbot, the persona. So we used a couple of other theories around there, like Leary's interpersonal complex, to understand the kind of characteristics and traits of the chatbot. We got them to draw an avatar. We got them to come up with names for the chatbot. And we also want to kind of look at the tone of voice, other characteristics around the chatbot. So, could it be based on a celebrity? Did it have a certain tone of voice? What were the types of utterances that they'd use for greetings, for fallbacks, just so it could allow us to kind of build up a bit of a picture of what this chatbot would look like. And in the end, they all want it to kind of be peer related. So a peer-based chatbot of around teenage years, so probably 13 plus, but maybe erring on the older range, so maybe 15, 16. And they wanted it to be engaging, positive, but also challenging, actually. So they want to be able to cooperate with the chatbot, but they'd like to be challenged. So if they had certain beliefs around physical activity, then they want to be told if they're wrong. We've seen that with other research we've done with students as well, which again to me was quite interesting. I didn't expect that, and again something for designers going forward, that maybe we don't want them to be all nicey. We actually want them to be challenging when there's incidents where people should be challenged on certain points or beliefs or attitudes, and maybe having a discussion around those as well to come to a conclusion, which again is important when we look at some of the interventions that we're looking to design for them. So we did quite a lot of co-design, and then the final stage was to build the prototype and then test it with the same young people, and also some random young people in the same school to evaluate it.
Nice. Yeah, it's interesting, the whole kind of like challenging situation. Like, we deal with a lot of businesses who are building and launching chatbots, and the only time that a kind of enterprise chatbot would challenge a user is if somehow the user or customer doesn't quite meet certain requirements. Like, can I have a refund, please? Well, actually, you bought this outside of the 30-day window, so typically you can't. That's the only time it would like challenge, is when you don't meet a certain requirement.
Yeah.
Whereas when you're dealing with things that are not necessarily matter of fact and rule based, it's more about perceptions and opinions. And it may well be still fact, but it's like saying to someone, for example, my nana, she still to this day believes that sugar is fundamentally good for you. And so we went on this, me and my wife Gemma went on this diet a few years back, and we quit sugar. Got this book, can't remember, Madeline Shaw, I think it is, I Quit Sugar for Life. Fantastic book. Hard to do. We did it for 3 months. We quit all packaged food, all refined sugars. And I was talking to my nana about doing this kind of like, we're doing this no sugar stuff. And she was like, oh, you absolutely need sugar. And it's like really good for you, and it gives you energy and all that kind of stuff. So it's like having that conversation with someone whose belief is fundamentally different is kind of challenging at the best of times, So it's interesting how so Ben on our team, Ben McCulloch, I don't know if it's released yet. I shouldn't share too much about it, but essentially he's publishing something soon, which is around the kind of like the shape-shifting nature of ChatGPT, which is that it always just wants to please you, and so it will just go with the flow all the time. Yeah. And actually, in extended interactions over time, that starts to piss you off a bit, because it's like all it wants to do is please you, and it will bend over backwards to please you, even if it's lying to you, not lying, but hallucinating, giving you inaccurate information. So the idea of kind of like young people wanting this thing to challenge them is quite a good one, because it shows that they know that they don't have all the answers,
Exactly. People tend to use and abuse, don't they, with large language models, and I think potentially if it's too nice, it could be taken advantage of even more, and you don't have that kind of same respect and even trust with it. And like you say, we know it hallucinates, but because it's so positive all the time, it kind of affects the level of trust that we have with it. So having that balance is really important, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I like that co-design approach as well. And it's because you're obviously not a teenager, and so having all the assumptions that you have or had prior to engaging with that group of young people, you're going to waste so much time building on your assumptions. So you could have just gone down a path, not involving, the people that you involved, the kids that you involved, and you could have gone down a path, made a load of assumptions, built something, put it in front of them, and found out it was all been a total waste of time, because it just doesn't align with their expectations. And I think there's a lot to be said for kind of designing with the user, because how would you write dialogue for a 14-year-old? What kind of language would you choose to use? What kind of tone would you use? It's questions that you only ever have assumptions for, because you're not a 14-year-old. So I think the co-creation element is something that's even in kind of like common or more mature design practices when it comes to conversation design, there's still not a lot of that going on. It's a common in mature UX practices, but the whole co-design thing is still something that is underutilized, in my opinion.
Yeah, we're trying to combine both really, and trying to get that kind of UI and UX and co-design across it, because I think it's important. I think it does interconnect, so it's important to get the views of the same population that you're working with. But I think you're exactly right. I think that's why I'd love to do some research around it, but in terms of failures around chatbots and successes as well, and to see the ones that have been co-designed, the ones that haven't, and whether that's made a difference in terms of success. I'm pretty sure it would have, but it'd be nice to look at that data and understand it from an evidence-based perspective. But yeah, I'm pretty sure. And without this, we wouldn't be able to understand the needs of young people, both from the studies we've done, the national studies we did, with the big kind of numbers from young people, but also the smaller, more personalised work on the ground, meeting young people in person, understanding them, trying to understand them. It's impossible to do that, but I think going forward as well, if we can get something which is engaging, which they do interact with, then based on the interactions we have in future, once they're using the chatbot, we can start to iterate even further and improve that personalization and the persona of the chatbot based on the feedback and the conversations that we're having with young people. So I think initially it's important just to get them engaging with it and wanting to use it, and then hopefully you can make further improvements down the line.
And so once you've gone through that initial sort of design phase, you mentioned that you created a prototype and then tested that with young people as well. What was your approach to building the prototype? Had you ever done anything like that before? Like, was there a certain tool that you sort of gravitated towards? Was it you that built it? Like, walk us through, if you can, the kind of creation part.
Yeah, so I built it. So I've been working on lots of kind of smaller projects when we first, so probably 2018, started playing with different projects and got some small funds. So we started using a tool called Mind Behind, which was great as an early kind of user of chatbots, just because it's a really kind of straightforward tool to set them up, and you can do pretty much everything you need to create a nice kind of chatbot with AI built in. So it gives you the kind of option to use different NLUs. So we use Dialogflow. We could have used Watson or Lewis. So we basically trained the NLU model based on data that we got from the young people, and based it around those barriers. So pretty much the NLU model can understand any of those 56 barriers to physical activity. And this, again, is where the co-design is really important, and having good quality data, because some of the utterances are wild. You would never have guessed that this refers to a particular barrier. But in just being able to look through that data, categorize it, speak to young people, it meant that actually the NLU is quite good, because it can understand lots of different types of utterances from young people, which adults would not be able to come up with, on their own. It'd be interesting to see whether ChatGPT can, if you got the right prompts, whether you could come up with some really good utterances. And I did test that, and they weren't that great. So again, it's really important that we do engage with young people around that nuance, around those particular utterances. So we did that. We then deployed the model, designed a prototype around it, created a couple of modules around confidence, so using self-efficacy theory. And one of my colleagues designed a module around that. It was an expert, he was a psychologist. And then I kind of put together the prototype, and then we tested it with those young people. So the model's around 80% accurate with very little testing. So we're quite happy with that. And I'm sure with further testing we can improve that a lot more. But initially, actually, when we did the testing with young people, I think it was around 95% accurate. And the only ones it didn't pick up were ineligible utterances from young people. So yeah, we're quite happy with that, but there's obviously a lot more work to do further down the line to kind of capture the range of responses that young people will provide us when we look at the more detailed intervention design around it.
Yeah, well, that would naturally, once it's out there in the wild and part of the optimization on an ongoing basis, you'll be doing things like that. Curious then how the two things come together. So you've got the prototype and a language model created. You've got a lot of input from young people around barriers and things like that. A lot of research supporting that. How do those two things come together? You've alluded to it a few times. COM-B, I think trans-theoretical domain framework you mentioned. You mentioned Lewis, interpersonal, complex, self-efficacy theory. There's a lot of theoretical frameworks that underpin all of this stuff. I wonder whether you can just walk us through what they are, how they work, and what the impact is on the conversation, so to speak. Maybe we can start with I don't know, it's up to you. You choose the best place to start. I don't know which one is the best one to start with, to be honest.
Yes, I think the main task was categorizing the barriers. So we took those barriers from the studies that we mentioned, and then I categorized those with a colleague of mine using the COM-B model. So we looked at what categories they fit into. So, for instance, the COM-B model relates to capability, opportunity, and motivation, and that leads to behavior. So if we're looking to change any type of behavior, we need to understand that, whether they're, in the case of physical activity, are they capable of being physically active? Do they have the opportunity to be physically active? And do they have the motivation to be physically active? And then we can go one step further with that, and we can use the trans-theoretical domains framework, which allows us to understand the factors which influence behavior. So the COM-Bs, the sources of behavior, and trans-theoretical domains framework is the factors which influence it. So, for instance, psychological capability. So we talked about anxiety, talked about fear of failure. There could be emotions around that, which when people do physical activity, they feel certain emotions. So the TDF would allow us to understand that kind of nuance around the barriers that young people face, and then allow us to look at what things we need to do to be able to change that behavior. And then what we do then is we still use a COM-B model, but the COM-B model also has what they call intervention functions, which are different ways that we can design interventions to overcome the barriers that we've identified. So mentioning capability, opportunity, motivation. So different intervention functions, it could be, for instance, training, it could be education. And then what we can go again is go a further step and use the behavior change taxonomy, which allows us to then look at those intervention functions and look at particular behavior change tools, which might have even been tested in other areas that we can use to be applied within those interventions. So it's quite a complex process, but actually it's easier when you've got the diagram in front of you and I can kind of point things out. But
I've just found the photograph I took of your
yeah,
slide.
yeah, great.
I don't know if you can see this from where you are, but that's basically it, isn't it? There.
Yeah.
Opportunity, capability, motivation, and all of the behaviors around, all the barriers, is it, around the outside? Is that right?
So the inner circle is a source of behavior. So capability, opportunity, and motivation. The yellow is an addition. They've added that to the COM-B. So that's the TDF. So that's kind of mentioned about the emotions and different areas, the factors which influence behavior. And the red ring is then those intervention functions which we can use to change behavior. And the outer ring is the policy that can be used or to use to drive that behavior. And in this case, the policy will be service provision, which is what we're offering really. We're providing a service through the chatbot to challenge all of those things. The only thing missing from that is the behavior change taxonomy, which just basically says, well, for this particular behavior, for these factors that are influencing behavior, these tools are the best one to use to try and change the behavior. Then by going through that process, it not only allows us to kind of give us a framework for designing an intervention, a conversational intervention, because we can adapt it to suit the work we want to do. So for instance, we've already chosen the behavior change tools, which can be delivered conversationally. So for instance, some which require kind of environmental changes, we wouldn't be able to do through a chatbot. But the ones involving conversations like social support, education, training can all be delivered within a chatbot. And also that gives an opportunity to evaluate, because we've got this framework, we know what the intervention is, so we can then personalize the evaluation based on the individual and based on the intervention that's being delivered, so we can develop the effectiveness rather than having a general evaluation which often doesn't reflect the intervention that's being provided.
Very good. Yeah, it's really good. So I had a different question that's escaped me now, but can we step through how that would translate to an actual conversation? So let's say that if I was a young person and I opened the chatbot, what's the actual conversation? So like you need to find a way of figuring out, first of all, like, does this person even want to have a conversation about exercise? Is that the first step, or do you jump straight into, is there already context set before they have the conversation, so they already know that they're going to be talking about this topic? Like, how does the conversation unfold, first of all?
Yeah, again, I think it depends on how the chatbot's delivered. So one of the areas we've looked at, and we did a DigiHealth Innovate UK program last year, which was brilliant because it allowed us to do some market testing. So we could speak to different organisations to see whether this is something they'd be interested in. So we spoke to doctors, people in the NHS, schools. And so if I take the schools kind of use case, for instance, we think that potentially, well, we know there's young people out there who are just not physically active, don't like PE, actually hate PE, don't want to engage with it, which makes it difficult for the PE teacher, difficult for the kids in the class, and not good for the individual because it can exacerbate certain issues that they're facing. So what we think is that if a PE teacher can identify this, then they haven't got the resource, the capacity to provide that support themselves. So potentially they could use the chatbot, give them a chatbot and say, look, this might be able to help you. It might be able to figure out, what's kind of preventing or causing these issues for you in PE around physical activity. So we give them the chatbot, and then the first question would be just introducing the chatbot. So the first information would be introducing it, and then the first question would be, what's the main thing that stops you from being physically active? And again, they could input anything that relates, and hopefully, if we've done our job right, then we can pick up anything that would relate to one of those 56 barriers. And then from there, we'll give them reassuring messages, say, yeah, we understand this. There's lots of young people suffering from this or experiencing this, and this is what we can do to support. And then we would deliver an intervention. So in the confidence module we've already created, we had a flow. It's probably about 5 minutes long, took them through it, allowed them to interact a little bit, gave them some information, allowed them to provide information about things they could do to improve their confidence, and then fed that back to them at the end of the conversation. But what we're also looking to do is more kind of longitudinal support. So provide other modules around goal setting, for instance, track participation as well, and then kind of have more interactive conversations further on to understand their experiences and provide support based on where they're at that particular time. Because there's another model called a trans-theoretical model, which basically allows us to understand what phase young people are at in their physical activity journey. So some might be not considering being physically active, others might be starting to consider it, others might be active but are just experiencing issues that are stopping them from doing more. So it's kind of getting that user context information as well to allow us to adapt the intervention to support them.
Nice. How does the COM-B play into the conversation? Like, do you ask questions about capabilities and why they might not be motivated and those kind of things? Is there anything around that kind of around that stuff, or is that kind of just related to, the barrier? So the barrier might be, I'm not motivated. So then you can just all of a sudden come back with, okay, we already know why you might not be motivated because we've done the research, and so here's an intervention for that sort of thing. Is that kind of how it works, or is there specific questions around the COM-B sort of framework?
Yeah, exactly. It depends on the barrier really. So if it's a particular barrier, I might have to ask some more questions to understand what their experience is. We might need certain questions to support the intervention. So it just depends on what that barrier is really. And the COM-B, the way it plays at the moment in the model is that when we know what the barrier is, because we've done the analysis, that will tell us that barrier is a psychological barrier, or it's a social opportunity barrier, or a physical opportunity barrier. And then we can then say, well, this is the type of intervention that the young person would need overcome that. And it gives us some context as well, so we know, if it's psychological, certain type of support will be required. If it's social, we might not be able to help them. So if it's, for instance, it's money, we can maybe provide some information about potential funding, or we can maybe highlight opportunities to be physically active on their own, going running, for instance, or doing individual activities. But what we're looking to do also is signpost people. So we're not trying to deliver everything through the chatbot. What we want to do is get them engaging with the community, or maybe other apps where interventions have already been set up, which are working really well, which are effective. So rather than deliver that ourselves, we might say, well, this app's going to be a much better tool. So for instance, Wobot, if they're depressed or suffering from anxiety, then that might be a better tool. Or Wiser, for instance, another mental health chatbot there. So it just depends on the intervention, and that's why it's important to kind of direct them in the right way, either through the chatbot or to other digital or social support that's available.
Nice. It'd be nice to even just hand off to Wobot in the conversation. No, I'm just going to pass you on to Wobot. Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, that's good. I like that. I like the idea. So you did the prototype. You're now kind of, what's the next phase? You're trying to take it into a product. Is that the next kind of phase? What's the next step?
Yeah, so we were actually doing a bit more testing. So I've since we did the last test, which was pretty successful. So young people reported improved confidence and motivation just from quite short interactions with a chatbot. But we want to do some more testing with users who've not been involved in the co-design. And we've added additional modules as well, which we can test some of the other interventions too. So once we've done that, we're just busy writing up the findings at the moment, because in order to get further funding, you need to have this published. And that's kind of what we're focused on at the moment. And then eventually what we're doing is applying for further funding to build a lot of these interventions. And we're actually going to be engaging with other experts, so those in physiology, psychology, and looking at different ways of delivering interventions. So looking at VR, gamification as well. So we've got around 10 interventions relating to about 15 barriers that we're looking to develop first. And then again, we'll test those and then do some more testing and keep building it that way. So the keys further funding really at this stage.
Yeah, nice. And maybe this question might be too premature then, given the stage you're at, but how would you think about sort of measuring the impact of this thing? Like, it's very noble. It's definitely, a perfect blend of there being a genuine need for it and it being the right kind of technology solution for it, seemingly. But it's a very complex subject matter, isn't it? You're dealing with psychology, you're dealing with kind of like confidence, motivation, you're dealing with people's economic situations. So what would kind of a really good yardstick for success look like for this thing? Let's imagine that it's funded, it's now productized, it's out there in the wild, it's being used. Like, how would you kind of measure the success of it? What would be the yardsticks you would look for?
Yeah, you're right. It's really complex, and that's why we're kind of looking at it from each barrier and each intervention. So for each intervention, there'll be a certain process for using the related theory, but it'll also be evaluated separately as well. So that will kind of allow us to use the evidence base to evaluate it, maybe compare that to other interventions that maybe aren't conversational, but at least give us an idea of the best way to kind of measure success for those. So we'll be looking to evaluate it independently of each intervention. So we might say have 5 interventions, and we'll actually do some research, longitudinal research around those first. And once we're confident with those, then we can start to utilize those and then work on the next set of interventions. So we could focus on the low-hanging fruit. For instance, like we mentioned, the money, the social angles, they could be the easier ones to kind of measure initially. And then the psychological ones would require much more in-depth evaluation and involvement from other experts. So that's how we're going to approach it. And I think in the past, a lot of evaluation has been very general. and they haven't really worked as well because we're dealing with really complex cases here. And I think the only way to really understand the success of it is to break it down and understand the behaviours and the interventions separately, and then try and make sense of that together once we have the evidence base.
Nice. I think the thing is having it based on those kind of behavior change models, and over time you'll be able to add capabilities in there that will allow you to more accurately kind of, assess people's situation. There may be tools out there that can read into things like, I don't know, sentiment, or if it's in a voice channel. You mentioned VR. The interface for VR is going to be voice. And so maybe you can pick up on things like confidence levels or motivation based on the tone of voice and stuff like that. And this is something that could potentially be everywhere, really. You can imagine it in Instagram messages, on Facebook Messenger, in Snapchat. Like, you can imagine this being deployed in any conversational channel, basically having a conversation with it on Alexa or anything.
Yeah, definitely. And like I mentioned, that's just the interventions. I mean, like you say, there's lots of other areas that we can evaluate. And engagement's the key, isn't it? You've got to kind of get that engagement first to be able to then start to measure interventions. But yeah, I think it could be available on lots of different channels. And again, it depends on the kind of delivery of a chatbot. So schools might have certain regulations. They might want it to be just housed within a school website or within a particular app that they have for the school. The NHS, they might just want it to be through the NHS app ecosystem, for instance. So it just depends on that. But I think with this is also lots of other use cases. So we're working on other projects around cancer rehabilitation, which has a physical activity element. But as I mentioned in that presentation a couple of weeks ago, I think, for business as well, for customer service, I think we can offer a more enhanced wellbeing support. At the moment, we're just kind of a lot of people are focused on just delivering the customer experience that's needed, or replicating what's already happening now, but just enhancing it. Whereas I think in future we can go that one step further and add wellbeing into the equation to provide a service, but also look at ways using these different interventions to enhance people's well-being. So like we mentioned about money again, it could be a bank, or it could be another organization where there's money, people can't afford certain services, and there might be other additional support that we can provide to give them some maybe money advice or money support, look at different ways they could earn money, and that applies to well-being, it applies to health. So I think there's lots of ways that we can really use this technology to enhance the services we offer, because previously there wasn't resource available to do it. Humans aren't able to offer that level of support. They're too busy doing the day job. But with conversational agents, we can go that step further and really help to improve people's lives, I think, through the everyday services and support that they interact with.
That's the promise of AI, isn't it?
Yeah.
Half of the world is the sort of dystopian view that it's all going to kill us, but on the other half, which is like, it really should be doing things that we can't do. It's impossible for us to do the things that you've just elaborated on with such consistency and at such scale. This could be having 5,000 conversations an hour.
Yeah.
And every single one of them will be exactly the same as the last one, whereas you try having any person. I mean, this one conversation, I have a podcast every week, sometimes twice a week, and by the end of the podcast, it is tiring because you're focusing, you're listening, you're really paying attention, and everything else disappears. So if you're working in like a contact center or whatever, it's exactly the same thing. You're listening all the time, you're focusing all the time, you're empathizing all the time, you're trying to help someone all the time. And to the best of your ability, you've only got so many good, productive hours in you on any day. Whereas AI doesn't get tired, doesn't have a day off, never phones in sick, doesn't turn up 5 minutes late. It's just on all the time. And it has capabilities that we don't. So the benefits to me are just, huge.
Yeah. And we've just mentioned customers, but actually the people who are doing the jobs, it's a bit of satisfaction, because it can't be great for someone when you haven't been able to help that person because you just haven't got the time to do it. But if there's something there, a conversational AI, which can say, well, have a look at this, see if it can give you that additional support that you require that can solve that problem, then that will make you feel better, won't it? Give you that little bit more of job satisfaction, and hopefully create a better experience for everyone when they're engaging, because we all know what it's like, when using different services, they don't always go well. And I think it's something that's, this got to be able to lead to a better opportunity to do that for everyone.
Definitely. I read a study, might have been yesterday or the day before. Was it Omeda? Might have been Omeda that produced this study, which is essentially, it was a customer experience study, and it was looking at people's kind of how do people feel about customer service and customer experience that they receive today from the businesses that they deal with regularly. And before COVID 2020, people thought that customer experience was kind of okay. It wasn't fantastic, wasn't terrible. COVID came, obviously it kind of just went sort of like through the floor basically, because everyone was freaking out and no one knew what was going on, and it hasn't really recovered. And this study was basically saying that compared to before COVID, even though since COVID everyone seemingly has been trying to really put a big effort into customer experience as a priority for loads of organizations, so it's a big focal point, it's getting a lot of attention, it's getting a lot of budget, it's getting a lot of resources put into it, but the actual people who need the services and businesses that they engage with think that customer service and customer experience has gotten worse in the last 4 years, which is mental, So any tools that are going to make our lives easier are absolutely, required. It's not even like a nice to have anymore. It seems as though like this stuff is fundamental, and figuring out how we make it work so that it is a productivity and a productive tool for both staff and for users is definitely where we kind of need to be focused. And I think that's why I was such a fan of your sort of approach. Albeit sort of like still early days, I think the steps and the methodology and the approach is absolutely ideal. It's basing everything on real science, on real kind of theoretical frameworks, and it's finding a way of taking that and layering a conversation on top of it, rather than kind of like, what most, like a lot of chatbots do, is they just recognize an intent, deliver an answer, and there's no real substance underneath it. So I definitely commend the work that you're doing, and good luck with taking it forward.
Thanks, Kane. Yeah, it's complex and there's a lot of work to do, but hopefully we're on the right path.
Definitely. Well, thank you for joining us, Richard. Absolute pleasure. Thank you all for tuning in, as always. Don't forget about Unparsed. I didn't mention Unparsed at the beginning of the podcast. How stupid of me! Unparsed is coming up in, I don't know, 4 weeks time now. It's very close. It's the world's first conversation design conference in person at London South Bank University on July 24th and 25th. Get yourself tickets at unparsconf.com. We've got the world's leading conversation designers are going to be there. They're going to be sharing the tricks of the trade and how you do conversation design effectively. Unparsconf.com. And as always, shout out to our presenting sponsors, Tidio. You can go to tidio.com/VUX if you want to find out a little bit more about Tidio's live chat and conversational AI platform, specifically for small and medium online businesses. And there's 20% off if you go to that link right now, tidio.com/VUX, tidio.com/VUX. Thank you again, Richard. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope to see you at the next one, and I'm looking forward to doing part 2 in person in the studio when you've taken it to the next level.
Definitely. I'm well up for that. Can't wait.
Nice one.